Now the poem is a pretty long one, and let's see whether we can make some divisions here. Lines 1 to 22 give us a general description of the landscape, the place where he is standing as he is telling us about what is happening around him. So it's a general description of the landscape, of the sprawling and the beautiful verdant landscape. From lines 23 to 57, he talks about memories, the power of his memories, the sustenance that he received from the memories of the earlier visit, and about how these memories kept him afloat even in times of great turmoil. From line 58 to 111, he tells us about the evolution of the relationship between Wordsworth, the man, and nature through his boyhood, youth, and maturity. How his interest in nature kind of moved or transformed from being merely a physical or a sensuous kind of a relationship to a very philosophical or an intellectual or a spiritual kind of a relationship. And then from lines 112 to 158, we have him talking about his sister Dorothy. So now let us look at the poem in detail. This is how it begins. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from the mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on the wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day is come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with the unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves amid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of spot of wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem, of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So the poet tells us that 5 years have passed, because this is a revisit, and so he had visited in 1793 and now it is 5 years since the last visit, and he says 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. So that is an indication that these 5 years that passed were not exactly happy 5 years for him. They were 5 summers that were as long as 5 winters. Okay, so that means that he had gone through a phase of unhappiness and trouble, unpleasant events. So that can be felt in those lines when he says that 5 summers with the length of 5 long. So the poet tells us is a revisit, and so he had visited in 1793 and now it is 5 years since the last visit, and he says 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. So that is an indication that these 5 years that passed were not exactly happy 5 years for him. They were 5 summers that were as long as 5 winters. Okay, so that means that he had gone through a phase of unhappiness and trouble, unpleasant events. So that can be felt in those lines when he says that 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again he says he is here and he hears the waters. There is this mountain springs, there is a kind of a river, I mean, of course, we are talking about the river Wye, and he can hear the soft inland murmur of the river. The river is not too loud, but it has got a very soft, subdued kind of a sound. And then he says, once again, I look at these steep and lofty cliffs, lofty, huge, tall cliffs, that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion. So this place is already secluded, because this is a place which is not frequented by many. It is a quiet place, a calm place. So it is already a wild, secluded scene, but the surrounding cliffs and mountains make it feel more secluded. That is why he says these steep and lofty cliffs impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. So as he stands there in this enclosed, cozy kind of a place, he can feel a closeness, he can feel a connect with nature, and he feels that the landscape and the sky are kind of touching each other, and they are mingling with each other, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. There is such serenity and calm. The day is come when I again repose here. So he says, once again today, he is sitting down maybe under a dark sycamore. Sycamore is the name of a tree, and he is leaning on the tree. He is reposing, relaxed, sitting there, or maybe half lying down under this dark sycamore tree. And from there, because he is standing at an elevated kind of a vantage point, from there, even when he's sitting there, he can see things below him. And what does he see? He views these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue. So this is maybe early summer, and so the fruits, there are of course fruits in all the trees. He talks about orchard. Orchard is a place where it's a garden of fruit trees. And why does he call them orchard tufts? Because looking from above, each tree looks like a tuft, a bush, and he can see plots of the cottage ground. He can see maybe the roofs of houses. He can also see the land that is divided into plots. That's why the plots of cottage ground. He can see the tufts of the orchards, and the color is just one green hue. Hue, of course, is color. It is just one green color, or maybe different shades of green color all over. No other color to be seen, because the fruits are still unripe. It's just the early stage of summer maybe, and it is towards the middle and the end of summer, when autumn comes near. It is then that the fruits ripen up fully and become yellow and orange and red. So now they are all one green hue. So looking from there, all this is mingled. He can see cottage grounds, orchard tufts, and the unripe fruits all in one green color lose themselves amid groves and copses. And a little that side and this side, he can also see groves and copses. Now copse, is a small wooded area. It's not exactly a kind of a dense forest, but a wooded area where you have a lot of trees growing in one place. Okay, so he can see all these from above. Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. So he says that because when you look at something from an elevated perspective, you can see divisions, you can see them as lines and plots and all that. And he says he can also see hedgerows. Hedge, of course, is a fence, and here it is not exactly a fence that is man-made, but then some plants have grown and they seem to form hedges. Now, even in our countrysides, earlier, many years back, people really didn't have walls between their plots. They used to plant some kind of shrubs or bushes which used to make a very natural kind of a border, a natural kind of a hedge. Okay, I think that is what he's talking about here. These hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. These pastoral farms, and then he can see the farms too. Green to the very door. There is greenery everywhere, such verdance. And up to the door of these pastoral farmlands, you can see just one color, and that is green. And in between this all pervading greenery, we can see something else. And what is that? Wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among trees. So smoke is curling up, white curls of smoke in silence from among the trees. Okay, and where does this smoke come from? It comes from the woods, where there are some vagrant dwellers, okay, with some uncertain notice, as might seem, of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. Now, those days, it was a time of industrialization, when people leaving their villages were moving to cities, and it was common to find homeless people who did not have a place to stay, and who used to work during the daytime in factories and in the towns, in the shops, and in the evening they used to retire to the woods and spend the night there. So that is what is the reference here of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. Houseless woods, in the woods where nobody has built any houses. So he knows that nobody lives in those woods, but then when he sees the smoke, he thinks that the smoke might be coming up from the places where these homeless dwellers, the vagrant or the wandering dwellers, are temporarily put up, or of some hermit's cave. So that might be the real explanation, a realistic kind of an explanation for the smoke. But he also gives us a very imaginative kind of an explanation. He says, or maybe there is a hermit who lives in a cave in the woods, a solitary hermit who lives alone, and maybe he has lit a fire, and so the smoke might be coming up from the hermit's cave too. So he gives us two options for the origin of the smoke. And wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. And I also remember reading a reference about how this wreaths of smoke can also be a sign of adoration to God. Smoke rising from sacrificial fires lit in prayer to God. Okay, so that interpretation is also there. I think we have come up to line 22, where he tells us about the setting and the landscape. And now he goes on to talk about how the memories of the previous visit had sustained him all these 5 years. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensation sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less, I trust, to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all his unintelligible world is lightened. Okay, it goes on, so let me stop. Now he says, these beauteous forms, that is this beauteous scenery, this beautiful scenery that he just described to us in the past few lines. Through a long absence, they have not been to me like a landscape is to a blind man's eye. Means like a blind man, a man who cannot see what lies in front of him, is not affected by what he sees, or what, I mean, he doesn't see at all. So a landscape would be wasted to a blind man's eye, unless of course somebody really describes it to a blind man. So here Wordsworth says that for me, this sight was not like a sight to a blind man, because I drank in everything that I had seen and I had preserved it in my inner eye. That is what he means to say that when often but oft in lonely rooms and amid the din of towns and cities I have owed to them. So he says when he was far away from this place, alone, in lonely rooms, in crowded cities and towns. What is this din? Din is the noise and the turmoil of towns and cities, and he had gone through a lot of depressing situations. Now especially he might be talking about his trip to France, his heady participation in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And then the French Revolution, though it was something that inspired people, what happened, because it was really wonderful to talk about equality and liberty and fraternity, but then what happened later was that during the reign of terror, after following the immediate years that followed the French Revolution, we know that things became very bad in France, and there was a lot of violence and bloodshed, and all the noble ideals of the revolution was kind of forgotten. And so that disturbed people like Wordsworth. They were terribly disillusioned by what the French Revolution had been reduced to. And so the French Revolution was a period of great moral and spiritual crisis for Wordsworth. And so he talks about all that here, and that's why he says hours of weariness, sensation. So when he was lonely and weary and sad and upset, at such times when he thought of these beauteous forms, what happened to him? Sensation sweet were felt in the blood and felt along the heart. So these beautiful scenes which he had preserved in his mind's eye, they served to refresh him, to rejuvenate him. They produced sensation sweet. He felt it in his blood, he felt it in his heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. So these beautiful sights, he says, had a healing touch on him. They exercised a tranquil restoration. They restored his lost peace and tranquility to him. They seeped into his purer mind. The innermost layers of his mind were permeated by these sights, and they gave him such tranquil restoration. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Now Wordsworth also believed that nature can induce goodness in man. That is why it is believed that people living in villages are more innocent, more simple. They are very good. So they have a lot of innate innocence and goodness in them, because they are surrounded by nature. And that is why always the rural and the village is equated with simplicity and goodness, whereas the city is equated with evil and complexities. So here he says that feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence. Okay, so he says that a good man, he might do a lot of simple acts of kindness, but though he doesn't, and he just goes on, you don't always remember all the good things that you did, but then the pleasure that you derive from acts of kindness, acts of love, remains in your heart. You may forget what the incident was, but the pleasure remains. You may forget what is the scene that you saw, but then the happiness that you derived then still remains. So he is talking about goodness and nature. So both of them, whether it is goodness or nature, they linger in your mind from the past experiences, and they continue to nourish you and replenish your mind. They act as fountains of newfound happiness and pleasure. Not less, I trust, to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mode in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. So he says, not only this, I have received another greater gift, another gift too from these sides, and that gift is more sublime, in the sense it's of a more lofty nature, more complex than this earlier simple pleasure. And what is that? He says that when I think of these sights and the kind of happiness that he received from nature, even in times of unhappiness, he was able to relax, and he was able to kind of elevate himself to a blessed mode. And there was this heavy and weary weight of this unintelligible world. Again, think about the disillusionment that he experienced. And again, Wordsworth had gone through a very turbulent period in his life. There is this incident, or there is this event in his life where when he went to France, he fell in love with a French lady called Annette Vallon, and a daughter was born to them, an illegitimate child, because he did not marry this Annette, but he had to abandon the lady and the child and return to England. He was forced by circumstances, and he could not really go back. And then his career as a poet was not exactly having a very promising beginning, because his poetry was not well received. And then the impact that the French Revolution had on him, altogether he was finding life very heavy, very burdensome. And at such times, when he thought of his visit to this place and other such experiences, he is able to experience a blessed kind of a mood when all the weight of his of the mind, his sorrows and the heavy burden is lightened. That serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and becoming a living soul. He talks about an almost hypnotic state, we may say, a serene and a blessed mood where he is led forward as if he is in a trance. Nature holds him by the hand and takes him forward until the breath of this corporeal frame. What is the corporeal frame? The body. And even the motion of the human blood. He becomes unaware of his breath, of the blood pounding in his veins, everything is suspended for a time, and we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. So he enters almost a hypnotic kind of a condition where he feels that he is one with nature. His individual soul has mingled with the living soul of the universe, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. So his eye, the eye that looks out into the external world, the eye that shows him the physical world, that eye for the time being is made quiet, and he experiences a kind of a harmony, a deep power of joy, and in this mood he feels that he can see into the life of things. He can see beyond the physical world, deep into the inner harmony of the universe, the life force. Many writers have written about this life force, the cosmic kind of a force that pervades the entire universe. In Indian way of thought too, we have this idea of the cosmic energy that embraces everything in this universe. All things animate and inanimate are they are engulfed in this permeating sense of well-being when you are in this mood. And so Wordsworth says that he has been able to reach that kind of an elevated mood when he thinks of nature, and at least for the time being he succeeds in forgetting all the troubles and travails of his present life. So that is the gift that he has received from nature, this capacity to move out of himself and go into the world of immense tranquility and peace. If this be but a vain belief, yet oh, how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan why, thou wanderer through the woods, how oft has my spirit turned to thee. So he says that this might, maybe you would feel that this is a vain belief, that this is a kind of a false belief, it is just an imagination. But yet he says, maybe I am just imagining all these things, but even then, how oft in darkness in the sense, the state of restlessness and disturbance that he has been through amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when it was day, but yet in his mind he experienced darkness. That is what he means by joyless daylight. When the fretful stir unprofitable, here again it may be a reference to the French Revolution. Here again it may be a reference to the French Revolution, a fretful stir unprofitable, a stir or a rebellion that did not yield the expected results. That's why it's unprofitable. And the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart. And he says that when all this has tormented me, hung upon the beatings of my heart, when such experiences had increased the pulse of my heart, and at such times, how often in spirit, though in body he was present amidst this turmoil, in spirit he had turned to thee. Now he is addressing the river Wye, Sylvan Wye. Sylvan, something that is a part of nature, the forest. And so he says that he addresses the river as Sylvan Wye and tells her, the river is a wanderer through the woods, and how often, Wordsworth says, his spirit has turned to thee and has received so much of relief, so much of energy from you. So now we have come almost to line number 57, and in these lines we saw how he talks about the memory that sustained him throughout the turbulent period of his life. And so he talks about how memory, the beautiful memory of nature, of his earlier visit to the Y, to Tintern Abbey, sustained him throughout the turbulent period of his life.